Hi, good morning. Thanks very much for allowing me to participate. My name is Heather from Verra. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. So I've been at Verra for 4.5, going on 5 years now. And what I really like is the impact that we have. And I've changed roles through Verra over the last 5 years. I started off as the manager for South Africa, and that was just after the 2019 carbon tax. And then eventually moved into Africa and then eventually the Middle East. For me, I'm happy in that role because I was born in Zimbabwe, so they call me the Gwelo girl. Gwelo was the little town that I was born in. And in the Middle East, I lived in Kuwait for 10 years, so I have some understanding of the Middle East. My current role is that I assist project developers and most recently governments in letting them understand and utilizing the Verra programs and standards, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The voluntary carbon standard is our flagship standard, and we also have a plastics and an SD Vista standard. So on the back of the carbon standard, where you get a credit for removing a ton of carbon out of the environment, you can also get a plastic credit, interestingly enough, because it's a very similar process. You have a methodology and you can get those credits. And interestingly enough, we were in Senegal 3 weeks ago now with Mandy Rambros, who you might know, who's a South African, who's our CEO. And she actually purchased one of those little cell phone desk devices that you can put your phone on. And it was the guy that actually made it, the gentleman that made that particular recycled phone cover, actually appeared in the impact video that Verra made on that particular project. So we kind of call that total recycling, and we did have a smile about it. The other project that we have is the SD Vista project, and the SD Vista program allows us to measure projects against the 17 United Nations goals. And the United Nations goals were made for countries. Why is it important for projects? It's important because someone from the global north who's sits in the ESG department and he's having to buy carbon credits, but he also is tasked with, for example, water. So he can go and have a look at our carbon credits and go, okay, that credit contributes to water or to women's health. So the SD Vista program is also key for us. So yeah, I'm very happy at Verra and happy to in my role as it's changed and evolved over time. So thank you for the next question. Have there been challenges? Yes, there have been challenges. But in terms of us, have the challenges, have we turned a corner based on these challenges of transparency and fairness? I would say absolutely we've turned the corner. And I think we've turned the corner forever. So before I explain this, I think that, and my reasoning for saying that with such strength and belief behind it, is that there are always good actors and bad actors in a market. So unfortunately, the carbon market is exactly the same. What we need to do is we need to manage the perceptions that are out there that are negative. And unfortunately, that's like trying to nail jelly to a ceiling. So we need to start talking about positive narratives and the positive impact that we have. Going back to the question, I think that there is a couple of things that have been done regarding transparency and fairness, both internally within Verra and externally in the industry and market itself. So internally within Verra, what have we done? We have done a number of things. We have digitized the process. So if you submit a document, for example, initially we'd have to get all the documents and we do an accuracy and a review check, and that would take 10 days. Now we have a project hub. You submit your documents automatically. It does the calculations for you because it has a carbon calculator inside of it. So therefore we can assess and process those projects very quickly, so that 10 days is lost in terms of the cycle because it's an automatic process. So in terms of digitization, we are processing documents much quicker through the project hub. And Justin, who's our director of the program, tells me that 95% of our SLAs are being met. So what do we mean by SLAs? SLAs is the service level agreements. And the service level agreement says we will take 10 days to do an accuracy review, 20 days to do a registration review or a validation, or looking at a monitoring report. The 5% that we're not achieving are the more complicated kind of projects that we have. So that's a very positive, and there's a risk-based approach that they are using in that project cycle. I think think the most exciting thing for me is that Verra has teamed up with the Heather Foundation, and it was announced in Senegal, where they digitized not only the submission of projects and the methodologies, but also the collection of data. So in the field, what we will do is we will accelerate these transparency and the auditability and the integrity of the methodologies. So in Senegal, we literally went into a mangrove. In the mangrove, there was a signpost that had a QR code on it, and the community could scan the QR code on their phone. And on that, what would happen is that they would then submit the data, and the data could be, they've done a salinity test in their 25 by 25 meter quadrant. What they would do is they would then submit the height of those plants, the little mangrove plants that have grown there, how many had survived for mortality rates, and that information can come live back into our project hub, which means that in theory, issuances could happen quicker. So there's been a lot of work done on our side to improve transparency, to improve accountability, fairness, and to involve communities. That said, I also said that the industry is changing, and the industry itself has, for example, bodies like the ICVCM. So they have got core carbon principles, and all the standards have to apply to them to be able to apply their core carbon principles to add integrity to our credits. We also have the VCMI, which is looking on the buy side and assisting buyers in looking at projects and what they can do and announce with their credits. And then we have the ratings agencies as well. So the ratings agencies, for example, will rate a project A, AA, B, C, which is something the financial world understands. And that allows buyers to be able to know what the integrity is and to kind of look at the transparency and fairness involved in that project. So I think a lot of work has been done. And in summary, we've turned the corner and we're looking for positive buyer signals now on the demand side. So talking about various verifications and the different methodologies, very simply, I think if people are familiar with the ISO standards, so in the ISO standards, you had ISO 9000, which was a quality standard. You had ISO 14000, which is the environmental standards. And then latterly, I suppose, 18,000 and 50,000, which is the energy standards. So Verra is no different in that we have created a standard document. It's short, as the ISO standards are, that you have to pay thousands of rands for. And it basically is a guidance document. So it says in there, for example, thou shall have a management system in place. Thou shall allocate a management representative. You shall do annual audits or regular audits. So the Verra standard is no different to that. It is based on ISO principles, and the standard document will explain to you and set out the principles that you should follow for your particular project that you are setting up. How does it link to methodologies? Underneath the standards document is methodologies, and the methodologies are the recipe almost for how you do those greenhouse gas calculations. And I'll give you a very simple example. And we all as housewives and people in our homes send rubbish out on a Monday morning, whatever day your rubbish is collected, and it goes to a municipal tip. The municipal tip is basically creates methane, and methane goes into the atmosphere, and methane is not a great greenhouse gas for us to be accounting for. So how do you deal with that? Municipalities would, for example, put a lid over that tip or that waste site. But remember, if that's like a pressure cooker, so if you've got the methane developing underneath and that exploded, there would obviously be a problem. So you have to have a pipe which allows some of the methane to go out, and you would flare some of that methane. So you would have a flow rate. Then you would have a burning rate. At the same time, you might have pipes underneath that particular cap, and they would be sucking the methane to the side of the plant. So there's a flow rate through those pipes. At the plant, you might be using Eskom power, which is not great in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions. So there's kilowatt hours used where you would be converting that methane into another form of energy. Assume that energy was distributed via trucks from that site to another source. You've got kilometers driven. So a methodology is basically the recipe that we use to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions. And in this case, I told you it consists of a flare rate, a flow rate, kilometers driven, and kilowatt hours. And that recipe is no secret. I mean, anybody could do that. But the inputs and the numbers that you use vary from Durban to Cape Town to Johannesburg, or even to Port Elizabeth, where I live. So that's what we mean by the methodologies. Verra has a number of methodologies. We have maybe 50 methodologies, and probably a higher number higher than that of methodologies that are coming into Verra to be assessed and approved, which I think is a healthy sign for the market. So that's really how the verification program works in terms of the standard and the methodologies. And a project would submit based on the methodology, submit their documentation, and then we would assess that using a third party so that we know that actually what they're proposing on the ground actually happens on the ground and it is validated. In other words, we check the predictions going forward into the future, and then we would go to site to go and check that that actually happened, and then issue the credits accordingly on our registry. So it's a complex process. It can take 2 or 3 years. It can take 6 months, depending on what the project is. But happy to help anyone if they have any questions on that. Yes, working in a constantly evolving and changing system. All I say is, thank goodness we're constantly evolving and we're still not selling horsewhips. So remember that old business school's teaching where, Henry Ford was like selling the horseless carriage, and people selling horsewhips were kind of going to go out of business. So I think it's a good thing there's change. That said, I do remember at school reading a book, it's orange, I can even remember it, by Alvin Toffler, called Change. And in that book, what he said was that change is normal. It's the rate of change that we need to deal with. So even in the last 2 weeks, I think we saw that, a friend of mine was in London, and he's thinking about whether he could fly back to the Middle East, but overnight there could be a ceasefire, not a ceasefire. Flights were cancelled, flights were open. So our world changes really, really rapidly these days. So in terms of a constantly evolving system, what I use is an analogy is a system of cogs. So when I was a mum, I am a mum still, but when my girls were younger, we had an early learning toy that consisted of 8 cogs. And each fridge magnet you stuck on the fridge that the kids could play with. But the main cog had a battery in it, and it drove the system. So it would go around in an anti-clockwise direction. The cog you connected to that would then go in a clockwise direction. And it made a whole lot of different patterns, for want of a better word. So in a changing carbon world, what I think of, and by using that analogy, is that I think that we have all the cogs that we need this time around. So we have the Paris Agreement. We have 196 countries that have agreed. We have the Article 6 playbook, which was issued in Baku. We have African countries issuing policies. We have African governments who understand the previous mechanism, which was the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, and how that worked and how you could get carbon credits. And so we have international standards, we have ratings agencies, we have insurance companies involved. So what I'm saying this time around is, yes, there's change. Change is normal, the rate of change is quick, but this time around I do think we have all the cogs, and we just need to put those cogs together so that we can connect them, so that we can make this market work. My favorite stories. Oh, I love this. So I think in terms of swapping and selling, I don't have any stories, but I think in terms of impact, I've got a couple of stories. And there was a project developer once who told me that she asked a lady who was involved in a project similar to cook stoves, so it was an energy efficiency cooking device, what made her happy about that particular project. And it's not unusual to hear on a cook stove project that, the lady is happy with the cook stove because she's got a job. She can afford school fees because she's not out collecting wood so frequently. Because she has money coming in, she can buy school shoes for her children who walk barefoot in the winter, to school. But this particular story, and my heart still kind of softens when I hear it, is that this lady liked this particular project because she said, I can now cook with dignity. In other words, she could cook standing up and not bending up over a fire. So there are some examples where, the benefits of these projects are hard to measure, but we know that their benefits accrue to the ground. And I did tell that story to our staff in 2021 in Washington, and I had all the ladies on the team in tears. And that particular project also has an app, so they can geolocate every single device that's in the distributed into the field. And this is actually a South African project, which is awesome. And the nice thing about using that app is that they use it to share recipes, and they'll also use it for general health, safety advice and tips. So I think there's a lot of additional benefits to these projects that go on the ground, and that's what kind of keeps me working in this field, seeing what people can actually achieve. The other story I have, second story I have, is solar water pumps. So there's a project in Kenya that I visited a couple of weeks ago. And what that basically is that there's a couple of pumps that people can buy. You can put the pump down into the river or into a borehole and draw water out of it. You get a certain pump depending on how much money you're prepared to spend, a certain length of pipe depending on the head that you need to draw against. And this particular gentleman got involved in the project, and he's a very clever MBA guy, so he's involved in finding the funding and doing the carbon side of it. But he said to me what hooked him on the project was that he went to go and see a gentleman on site, and the gentleman said that as a result of having the pump, he now has 6 growing seasons in a year as opposed to 1, which is guaranteed for rain. Perhaps half a growing season because half the vegetables will grow and not because the rain wasn't so great. And as a result of having 6 growing seasons, he now has enough income to put his son through university. So he said to the gentleman is that my son will be educated and I wasn't. So those are the kind of impact stories that I think from these carbon credit projects that need to be told. They are told through our impact stories, and that what makes me get to my desk every day. So what is Africa doing in terms of making the most of natural resources? As soon as I see natural resources, I convert that to carbon projects. So I see lots of opportunities being taken up in the last few years and in my travels. Obviously, clearly, I alluded to the solar water pump project. There are a lot of cook stove projects. I think in Kenya, what I've seen is a direct air capture project, which you might think is unusual because it's these large containers that they put down that literally suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And you sort of assume that that's for the global north. But it requires a lot of energy to be able to suck that atmosphere in. And in Kenya, we're sitting on the Rift Valley. And on the Rift Valley, we have geothermal energy. So geothermal energy is cheap. And so I've seen certain companies start to put down their containers and negotiate with communities to start to do this. And this is just making use of natural resources in Africa, which I think is fantastic. Here in South Africa, we've got, agricultural projects where this particular company used, in fact, a dairy just outside Port Elizabeth. And those farmers were dairy farmers, and they had data which they were using in their track and trace system. And they were able to use that to claim carbon credits. And they're now expanding that into different sectors like the wheat and the maize sectors. There's also grassland management. And then, of course, in South Africa, we have a few spekboom projects coming along. And then biochar has just popped its head up in the last couple of months. I think the other opportunities in Africa are that they're all distributed. So it's not going to be one large industrial project where we're saving, a gazillion tons of carbon. It might be that it's a whole lot of little projects. So, for example, what I see in my travels in East Africa and West Africa is e-bikes. And these have started to penetrate in Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya. In Kenya, they call them boda-bodas. And so what happens is a person drives a little e-bike. They are expensive initially, but the carbon finance assists. Instead of putting fuel in it, which is obviously not good for the environment, they can then go and swap a battery. So in South Africa, we swap a gas bottle, but maybe you could swap a charged battery. And as long as that battery is charged through renewable energy, then one can claim the carbon credits for that. And instead of using, I've read numbers of $11 a day being spent on fuel, it would maybe only charge them $3 or $4 a day to swap the battery. So there's a saving there for those particular communities. But this is again using solar resources in Africa. So I think Africa is using its natural resources, and we just need to continue to scale to drive that VCM finance to those particular projects. So which countries are doing the right things? I think it would be remiss of me to mention or point out 1 or 2 countries. I travel a lot. I've been to the East African Carbon Alliance meeting, the West African Carbon Alliance meeting, And I see a lot of policies and frameworks that are being developed presently. However, they are all at different levels. So country could be really well advanced in its policy, and one is still trying to kind of figure out the nuts and bolts of it. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think that makes an unfair comparison for countries. I think what's more important is that we look at, when we're looking at countries, is to what are they doing to encourage project developers to come into their country. So, and to build those carbon projects either in the voluntary space or the compliance space. So I think what's important is that countries, in terms of doing the right thing, need to don't do things like don't charge exorbitant prices just to list a project with the government. That information is available on the registries. Don't withhold letters of approval, because you need a letter of approval in order to make your credits fungible to be used in the Paris Agreement. Don't charge super high fees for corresponding adjustments, because they need to account for the project had an impact in the ground. They need to submit that. If they've sold those credits, they need to deduct it from their actually add it onto their carbon footprint as a country. So I think the countries need to start to make a legally sound environment. They need to be very clear in terms of their policy, what projects are acceptable in their country and what projects are not acceptable. And I think that, as I said, once again, to name one or two countries at this stage would not be fair, but there is definitely movement in the right direction. So my vision for carbon markets this time around is that African leaders and African countries don't miss the boat, literally. So in the Clean Development Mechanism, which was under the Kyoto Protocol before, what happened was only a couple of projects were registered, and African countries were a little bit left behind. And I think I saw something like 3,500 wind projects in China. So they capitalized on that particular opportunity. This time around, Africa, I think, needs to catch up a little bit. That said, I'm seeing a lot of movement in governments and discussions. So as I said, I was recently in West African Carbon Alliance, East African Carbon Alliance, and countries will literally send delegations from one country to another to learn from each other, to learn how they are creating their policies, how they are addressing the Article 6, how they are addressing their nationally determined indicators and contributions, and how they can best capitalize on this market going forward. So I think that that's really exciting to see this genuine interest, this genuine attempt to scale up these markets, and a lot more policies coming out. So I think that it would be great to see. My vision would be that we have lots of projects on the continent, because also there's a lot of those social benefits that get attached to that. So the ST Vista project, as I said, you can label your project with that. You know, there's a lot of benefits that accrue to the ground and to communities, which people are looking for when they buy a credit these days. So the last thing I'd like to add is that carbon markets are not perfect. Obviously, there's always a criticism of them. It's the best tool we have right now. I do see a lot of impact as a result of the work that we do at a community level, and communities are definitely involved and definitely collecting data and definitely wanting to be a part of these projects and processes. So therefore they take time, because you're trying to involve communities as well as take into account legislation and get the project process approved. So I think it's really important that we don't diss the market so much that it fails. And then I think what now is the most important thing is that we need scale. We need scale to make these projects work faster, quicker, involve the communities, so that we can basically, as I said, reduce carbon dioxide. For me, I'm a mother, and I want to make sure that I leave the world in a better place for my twins.